Well, I have 7 o'clock, so I think we'll get rolling. I would like to welcome everyone. Good morning. I'm Paul Gross. I'm the Extension Educator, Field Crops in Isabella County. Pretty excited to kick off our second season of the Field Crops Virtual Breakfast. We're pretty excited this year. We're going to be serving up some real timely information for growers as we go through the season. Each week the format's going to be, we're going to have start off with one of our specialists, and then we're going to have the second half of the half hour with Jeff Andresen with weather. So it's warming up, the weeds are popping, so we're going to be starting off with Dr. Christy Sprague talking about early season weed control. For those who are joining and have the ability, please have questions, put them in the chat box, and we'll get them asked to Christy when she wraps up. So Christy, good morning, and the floor is yours.
Good morning, Paul, and good morning to everybody. I hope everybody is having a great morning. It looks like we're going to have another great day. I know yesterday was a pretty good day, and there was actually some field work going on. So what I really would like to do today is talk a little bit about early season weed control, some things to consider as we move into the season. This year's kind of been I don't know, almost like last year in some ways, and maybe just a little bit better. But I know in general we've had the last couple of weeks a few times where we've been really dealing with a lot of kind of more wetter weather and sometimes relatively cool. What I did, and I'm sure Jeff will talk a little bit about what weather conditions we've had, but I just kind of pulled from around this area kind of our growing degree days up to this point from the last 3 years. And I knew last year we were extremely cool, and that really slowed down a lot of the weed growth. We are definitely ahead of last year, but not quite where we were in 2017 as you kind of look at the growing degree days up until this point. And really what that means is kind of tells us a little bit about how quickly our weeds are growing, how things are kind of progressing. And as we kind of are moving forward, we're just kind of starting to get into the swing of seeing a little bit more field work. I know up to this point there hasn't been a whole lot that's been done. And what I'm going to talk a little bit about is some of the things we should be thinking about from an early season weed control standpoint, as well as maybe talk a little bit about some of those wheat herbicide applications. As we start seeing those warmer temperatures, we're definitely going to see some of that increased weed growth. And, as the weeds start to grow and everybody gets itching to plant, sometimes one of the things that really happens is some of this competition that we see for some of the field operations. Should we really be, a lot of guys want to get out there and plant, but it's really important to think about, okay, how do we manage those weeds so they're not impacting basically our crop yields at the end of the season? And one of the reasons, or there's several reasons why we want to control those weeds prior to planting. Obviously, some of them they can definitely interfere with some of those planting and tillage operations, especially when you get some really thick mats of weeds, and kind of just doing some drive-bys as well as looking at some scouting over the last couple of days. We've got fields that vary anywhere from just a few weeds that are coming up to some pretty substantial winter weed growth. So definitely some of that can interfere with some of those planting and tillage operations. The other thing is once we get things planted, they compete with the crops for moisture, light, nutrients as those seeds start to germinate, and can interfere with emergence of the crops, whether it's soybeans, corn, or any of the other crops that we might be planting. Some of those weed mats can also harbor some destructive insects, seed corn maggot, a lot of these wireworms. Some of these can really be a problem if we're not controlling those weeds. And over the years, there's been a lot of winter annuals that have also been shown to be hosts for soybean cyst nematode. And then one of the other things is as a lot of those weeds get bigger, they're definitely harder to control. And some of those weeds that I kind of think about is particularly things like mare's tail or horseweed. That's definitely one, once it gets some size, even with trying to think about some of the ways that we can manage some of the resistant populations that we have, they're definitely harder to control. And again, just to kind of bring it back into where we're at, with the mare's tail or horseweed, it's definitely one of the bigger issues that we have in trying to control some of our early spring weeds. That's one that pops up everywhere. And just kind of keep in mind that when we're thinking about depending on what we're doing, in a Roundup Ready system or a non-GMO system, we really don't have any good post options for control. So I know a lot of people are switching to using other soybean technologies to try to get this a little bit under control, but I think it's still very important that we start out trying to control this early. And as I've kind of looked at some of our areas where we're doing some research, we are starting to see a lot of the mare's tail starting to emerge. Some of it's getting a little bit of size to it. So it's one of those things that we're going to definitely have to control prior to planting. So when we're thinking about good weed control early in the season, there are still a lot of people that do tillage. If we've got thick mats of weeds out there prior to tillage, it might be a good idea to do a burn down application. And it's really important to make sure that we do a nice uniform disturbance on those upper few inches. Remember that vertical tillage tools are great for helping prepare seed beds, but they're probably not going to control a lot of the weeds. So in some cases where people are going to be using a vertical tillage tool, you know, a burn down application, if there's a lot of weeds out there, might be a good idea. So we've got a lot of different burn down applications we can use, and I'm going to really focus more on soybeans, but we do also have several for corn and some of the other crops that we do plant. And I'm going to kind of give an example about what happens if we don't do a good job in controlling weeds prior to planting. And really what can happen is that early season competition can really affect our yields at the end of the season. And this was some work that we did several years ago where we had a couple different locations and just kind of looked at what happened if we did not control the weeds prior to planting. And this is kind of a stair-step effect showing if we controlled weeds at planting compared to some of the other ones a little bit later. And you can see that we definitely, as the longer we wait, we do reduce yield. And if we just waited until, you know, what we would think of most of the weeds coming up, we can see up to almost close to a 9 bushel per acre reduction, which with today's prices would be pretty much a $72 per acre loss. So that really, you know, you start thinking about how much it costs to control those early season weeds. You can definitely make it up in yield at the end of the season. And really, by delaying that, some of the things that we've calculated out that can actually be equated to almost losing a quarter bushel per acre per day of soybeans. So we do have a number of different spring burn down options. Some of these you need to wait a little bit longer, but here's just a few options that are out there. Not going to spend a lot of time going through these. We do have these listed in our MSU weed control guide, but just to point out again, some of these we do need to apply possibly a little bit prior to planting. One of the newer ones, Alvor, that does need to be and applications need to be 14 days prior to planting, so probably not a huge fit in Michigan. We still do have a lot of 2,4-D ester applications that happen, and remember that does need a 7-day prior to planting application timing. The other thing to think about is early season weed control. Those soil applied herbicides are extremely important, especially when we're trying to control some of the herbicide resistant weeds, especially glyphosate resistant weeds, whether it's mare's tail or horseweed, or some of the pigweed species like water hemp that's really popping up around the state, as well as things like Palmer amaranth. The two main groups of herbicides that are probably the most effective on some of these different weeds is definitely metribuzin from the mare's tail or horseweed standpoint, and then also the group 14 herbicides have some activity on that, as well as those are probably our better ones for controlling some of our pigweed species like water hemp and Palmer amaranth. And in most cases, if we can, there's a lot of different premixes out there that contain both metribuzin and one of the either sulfentrazone or flumioxazin products, and those mixes do a really good job in trying to give us some residual control of some of those different species. So just a reminder, we do have an updated fact sheet that can be found online. It is also in the back of the MSU Weed Control Guide on page 217. So really talks about some of the different traits that we have and what are some of the more effective burn down strategies, particularly in trying to control mare's tail, because that has become one of the bigger issues. So again, this is kind of a 3-page deal where we're talking about some of the different steps. Another thing to think about is when you're putting on those pre-burn down or those burn down herbicides or some of those pre-emergent soil applied herbicides, most of those do need to be applied prior to soybean emergence. So, sometimes the planter gets way ahead of the sprayer, and we want to make sure that those beans are not emerged when we make those applications, because whether we're using one of the Valor type products or the Authority type products or Metribuzin, if those beans are coming up, we will have some issues. Looking at corn, again, very important to start out clean, and then also those residual herbicides are extremely important. In some cases, we do see potentially where corn is up before those soil applied herbicides are made, and we do have a little bit more flexibility on corn. There are some of those that can be applied kind of in an early post-emergent stage, and a lot of those different types of products can be found in the weed control guide on table 1H. So just to kind of give you some more focus of different places to look. And then lastly, just to mention a little bit about wheat. We've got wheat that's in all different stages across the state, and that really gives us some questions on when do we make those applications and what are some of the things we need to consider. When we're looking at that, we want to make sure we're making applications to wheat when weeds are actively growing. We really don't want to make those applications when the crop is under stress, and a lot of times that usually has to do with cool weather. Kind of a good rule of thumb is to make those herbicide applications in winter wheat when the daily temperatures are at least 50 degrees or higher. There are other things to think about. We have very few options if we have frost-seeded red clover. MCPA is probably our only safe post-emergence option that has broadleaf activity. Some of the nitrogen applications didn't go on earlier. We can use some of these as a carrier, and we do have some precautions on those. And then again, just kind of keep in mind that wheat growth size and what weeds are controlled. So there is an article that I've put out that will be in the MSU News today talking about all the different things to think about with herbicide applications in winter wheat this year, as well as thinking about early season weed control. And then just to mention, we are starting to see a lot more grasses. The rough stalk bluegrass is one that's popped up. One thing that I will tell you with a lot of the delays in wheat planting last year and just some of the not a lot of wheat growth in the fall because of some of the cooler wet temperatures, just to show you some plots that we have. Rough stalk bluegrass on the from 2018 on the left-hand side, and then this is in 2019. So kind of a big difference in growth just based on when wheat was mostly planted and some of the cooler temperatures that we had this last fall. So with that, we do have a website. You can get to it by msuweeds.com by Googling that. The weed guide is listed on there. You can also purchase those at the MSU bookstore on campus. And just a quick plug for Ag Innovations Day this year on July 26th on campus. And with that, I will open it up. I think we might have a couple minutes for some questions.
Yeah, thank you, Christy. We do have one question. With 2,4-D ester and planting Enlist 3 soybeans, do you still need to wait 7 days until planting?
So, so with the Enlist E3 soybeans, if you're going to go closer to planting, you would need to use their Enlist 1, which is their 2,4-D choline salt. So it would just be buying a different 2,4-D. So if you're going to be, 7 days prior to planting, you could still use the ester formulation, but just with the way that the labeling is, you would have to use the choline salt if you're going to be closer in the Enlist soybeans.
Okay, thank you very much, Christy. Very good information. I know the wheat's going to be a real challenge this year because of how spotty it is, and those growth stages are just all over the board. So that's something that I think wheat growers are really going to have to keep an eye on. So that's all for questions, Christy. We thank you, and we're going to transition now to Jeff Andresen with weather.